The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the old barn, its golden light filtering through gaps in the wooden slats, like fingers reaching into Thomas McKenna's private sanctuary of grief. The autumn wind whistled through the Wyoming valleys, carrying with it the scent of dried grass and the distant promise of winter's approach. At 72, Thomas had weathered many storms, but none had left him as hollow as the one that took Martha 3 months ago. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he dipped the worn fountain pen into the small inkwell, the same pen Martha had given him on their 25th wedding anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on him, using her gift to write his final words. The rough wooden table before him, cluttered with old bridles and rusted horseshoes, now held a single sheet of paper, half filled with his careful script. "My dearest Martha," he had begun, though the words seemed to mock him now. How could he address someone who would never read them? Yet somehow, writing to her felt natural, as if she might still be sitting on the porch, waiting for him to finish his evening chores. The barn creaked around him, its familiar sounds a symphony of decades spent caring for horses, mending tack and finding solace in honest work. But today these sounds felt different, final. The bay gelding in the corner stall whinnied softly, as if sensing his master's despair. Thomas had already arranged for neighbors to care for his livestock. The Hendersons, despite their own struggles, had promised to look after everything. Good people, the Hendersons, though Thomas wondered if there were any truly good people left in a world that could take Martha so suddenly. The influenza had swept through their small community like wildfire that summer. Martha, with her generous heart, had insisted on nursing Mrs. Patterson's children when the sickness struck their family. "It's what neighbors do, Thomas," she had said, her green eyes sparkling with the determination he had loved for 47 years. She had saved those children, but the fever claimed her just 2 weeks later. Thomas set down his pen and rubbed his weathered face, feeling every line etched by decades of sun and wind. The ranch felt impossibly large without Martha's laughter echoing from the kitchen, without her humming while she tended her vegetable garden, without her gentle hand on his shoulder when the day's work was done. The house had become a mausoleum of memories, each room a testament to a life shared and now unbearably solitary. He picked up the pen again, forcing himself to continue. The letter needed to be finished before his resolve wavered. He had already decided on the method. His father's old Colt .45, the same gun that had protected their family through the Indian wars of his youth. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the weapon that had once preserved life would now grant him the peace he craved. "I cannot bear another sunrise without your smile," he wrote, his handwriting growing shakier with each word. "The coffee tastes like ash. The sunsets have lost their color, and the silence where your voice should be has become unbearable." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors. The sound was sharp, insistent, like Martha's voice when she was trying to get his attention, but Martha was gone, buried in the small cemetery overlooking the valley, beneath a simple wooden cross that bore her name and the words, "Beloved wife and friend to all." Thomas paused, listening to the wind. In its howling, he could almost hear her scolding him. "Thomas McKenna, you stubborn old fool, what do you think you're doing?" But it was just the wind, just his mind playing tricks on a heart too broken to heal. The ranch sprawled around the barn, 2,000 acres of grazing land, a modest farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and the memories of a lifetime spent building something meaningful with the woman he loved. Now it all seemed pointless, a monument to dreams that died with Martha. He dipped his pen again, determined to finish. "I have lived a good life because of you, my dear, but I cannot live a life without you. Please forgive me for what I am about to do, and know that every day we shared was a gift I treasured." The barn door suddenly creaked, a sound different from the wind's symphony. Thomas looked up, frowning. He had latched it securely, hadn't he? The afternoon light shifted, and he heard something that made his blood run cold, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the hay-strewn floor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. "Who's there?" The footsteps paused, followed by a whispered conversation too quiet for him to make out the words. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting hunched over his letter. As he moved toward the sound, 5 small figures emerged from behind the old hay bales, their forms backlit by the fading sunlight streaming through the open door. Children, 5 children, ranging from what appeared to be 5 years old to perhaps 12, All of them dirty, thin, and clutching each other with the desperate solidarity of the abandoned. Their clothes were little more than rags, patched and repatched, and their faces bore the hollow look of those who had known too much hunger and too little kindness. The oldest, a girl with tangled brown hair and eyes too old for her young face, stepped forward. In her trembling hand she held a crumpled piece of paper. "Mister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you Thomas McKenna?" Thomas stared at the 5 small faces before him, his mind struggling to process this impossible interruption. The girl who had spoken, clearly the leader of this ragged band, held his gaze with a steadiness that reminded him painfully of Martha, when she was determined about something. Behind her the other children huddled together, 2 boys who looked to be brothers, their sandy hair matted and their identical green eyes wide with fear and hope. A small girl of perhaps 5, clutching a threadbare doll missing an arm, and another boy, maybe 8, whose dark skin and serious expression spoke of hardships beyond his years. "I asked you a question, mister," the older girl repeated, her voice stronger now but still trembling. "Are you Thomas McKenna?" Thomas nodded slowly, unable to find his voice. In all his planning for this final afternoon, he had never imagined being discovered, especially not by children who looked like they hadn't eaten in days. The sight of them stirred something deep in his chest, a protective instinct he thought had died with Martha. "My name is Sarah," the girl continued, taking another cautious step forward. "These are my friends. Well, we ain't really family, but we look after each other. This here's Billy and Bobby Morrison. That's little Emma and that's Samuel." She gestured to each child in turn, and Thomas noticed how they all stayed close to her, drawing strength from her presence. "How did you find me?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. "What are you children doing out here alone?" Sarah's grip tightened on the crumpled paper. "We've been walking for near 3 weeks, following the railroad tracks mostly, sleeping rough and eating what we could find. The orphanage in Cheyenne." She paused, her young face hardening with memories she was too young to carry. "Well, let's just say it weren't no place for children, if you catch my meaning." Thomas felt a familiar anger stirring in his chest, the same righteous fury that had once driven him to defend his neighbors against claim jumpers and rustlers. He had heard whispers about some of the institutions that claimed to care for orphaned children, places where kindness was scarce and cruelty was common. "We got nowhere else to go," Samuel spoke up, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of parents who might have come from the South, perhaps seeking a better life in the territories. But Sarah, she remembered something her mama told her before she passed, about a man who once helped folks when they had nowhere to turn. Sarah nodded and slowly extended the crumpled note toward Thomas. "My mama, she worked as a seamstress in Cheyenne before she got sick. She told me stories about the early days, when this territory was still wild and dangerous. She said there was a man named Thomas McKenna who helped her family when they first came west, when her papa got hurt and couldn't work." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. With trembling hands, he took the note and carefully unfolded it. The paper was yellowed with age and the ink had faded, but he recognized the careful handwriting immediately. It was Martha's script, but from many years ago when her letters were more angular, before arthritis had softened her hand. "Mr. McKenna," the note read, "I cannot thank you enough for what you did for the Brennan family. Your kindness saved us when we had nothing, and I will never forget how you gave my father work when his leg was mending, or how you sent food when we had none. You told my father that someday when we were able, we should help others the same way. I pray that if anything ever happens to me, and if my Sarah needs help, someone will remember your example and show her the same mercy you showed us. The world needs more men like you. With eternal gratitude, Mary Brennan." Thomas stared at the note for a long moment, memories flooding back like water through a broken dam. Mary Brennan, he remembered her now. A pretty Irish girl, maybe 16, with eyes the same shade of brown as Sarah's. Her father, Patrick, had fallen from a roof while helping to build the new church and broken his leg badly. The family had been destitute, strangers in a harsh land with no one to turn to. Martha had been the one to notice them first, of course. She always noticed people who needed help. "Thomas," she had said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, "that Irish family that came through last month, I heard the father's still laid up, and they're running out of money for food and lodging." Without hesitation, Thomas had ridden into town the next morning and offered Patrick work he could do sitting down, mending tack, organizing inventory, keeping books. It hadn't been charity exactly, but it had been compassion dressed up as business. When Patrick's leg healed enough for heavier work, Thomas had helped him find a position with the railroad crew. "Mary Brennan was your mother?" Thomas asked, looking up at Sarah. The girl nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She died of the consumption last winter. Told me about you before she passed, said if I ever got desperate enough, I should try to find the man who helped her family. She said you were good people." "Martha," Thomas whispered, understanding now why these children had appeared at this precise moment. His wife had always believed that kindness returned to you when you needed it most, though usually in ways you never expected. She would have wanted me to help you. Little Emma, who hadn't spoken yet, stepped forward and tugged on Thomas's coat. When he looked down at her, she held up her broken doll. "Her name's Annie," she said in a tiny voice. "She's lost her arm, but she's still good. Mama said broken things can still be loved." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Here was this small child, orphaned and homeless, comforting him with wisdom beyond her years. The irony was almost unbearable. At the moment he had given up on life, life itself had walked through his barn door in the form of 5 lost souls who needed exactly what he thought he no longer had to give. "When did you last eat?" Thomas asked, his voice gentler now. Billy, one of the twins, spoke up. "Yesterday morning. We found some apples that fell from a tree near the road." Thomas looked at their thin faces, their hollow eyes, their clothes hanging loose on frames that spoke of too many missed meals. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "Feed them first, ask questions later. That's what decent people do." Without another word, Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. The suicide note lay forgotten on the workbench as he moved toward the barn door. "Come on then," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. "Let's get you fed and cleaned up. Then we'll figure out what comes next." As the children followed him toward the house, Sarah fell into step beside him. "Mr. McKenna," she said quietly, "I know we're asking a lot, and we got no right to burden you with our troubles, but we didn't know where else to go." Thomas stopped and looked down at her, this brave young girl who was trying so hard to be strong for the others. In her face he saw Mary Brennan, but he also saw Martha's spirit of determined compassion. "Child," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "sometimes the Lord sends us exactly what we need, even when we don't recognize it at first. Maybe especially then." The kitchen felt different with 5 pairs of eyes watching Thomas move about with unfamiliar urgency. For months he had barely bothered to light the stove, subsisting mainly on cold biscuits and whatever the Henderson women brought over out of Christian duty. Now, as he pumped water into Martha's large cast-iron pot and began stoking the fire, the room seemed to exhale, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for life to return to its walls. "Sit yourselves down at the table," Thomas instructed, gesturing toward Martha's handmade dining set. The children approached cautiously, as if fine furniture might disappear if they moved too quickly. Sarah helped little Emma onto one of the chairs, while the twins, Billy and Bobby, sat close together, their identical faces showing a mixture of wonder and wariness. Samuel remained standing until Thomas gave him a gentle but firm look. "All of you," Thomas said more softly, "this table has seen plenty of hungry folks over the years. My Martha, she never could stand to see someone go without a good meal." As he began pulling ingredients from Martha's well-organized pantry, Thomas felt her presence strongly. She had always been the cook in their household, transforming simple ingredients into meals that could warm both body and soul. His own culinary skills were limited, but he knew his way around basic frontier fare: beans and bacon, cornbread and strong coffee. "Mr. McKenna," Sarah said hesitantly, "we don't need much. Just a little something to stop the aching in our bellies." Thomas paused in his preparation and turned to face her. Even in her desperation, this child was trying to minimize her burden on him. It reminded him painfully of Martha, who had always put others' comfort before her own, even when they were struggling to make ends meet in the early years of their marriage. "Child, when someone sits at my table, they eat proper," Thomas replied, his voice carrying more authority than he had felt in months. "That's the way Martha ran this house, and it's the way it'll be run as long as there's food in the pantry." He set about preparing the meal with movements that gradually became more confident. First, he sliced thick strips of bacon and set them sizzling in Martha's favorite iron skillet. The smell filled the kitchen, and he heard little Emma's stomach rumble loudly enough to make the twins giggle. the first sound of childhood joy he had heard from any of them. While the bacon cooked, Thomas mixed cornmeal, flour, and salt for cornbread, adding milk from his cow, Bessie, and eggs from his small flock of hens. Simple ingredients, but they represented abundance to children who had been foraging for fallen apples. As he worked, memories of Martha doing these same tasks flooded back, but for the first time in months they didn't bring only pain. Instead, they brought a bittersweet comfort, as if she were guiding his hands. "How long you been on your own, Mr. McKenna?" Samuel asked quietly, his intelligent eyes taking in the details of the kitchen, the single coffee cup by the sink, the layer of dust on the good china Martha had been saving for special occasions, the unopened preserves lining the shelves. Thomas considered the question as he poured the cornbread batter into Martha's well-seasoned pan. "My wife passed 3 months ago," he said simply. "Been just me since then." The children exchanged glances, and Sarah nodded with understanding beyond her years. "We lost our folks at different times," she said. "Sarah's mama was the last to go, and she looked after all of us at the boarding house where we lived. When she died, they sent us to that place in Cheyenne." "What happened there?" Thomas asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Billy and Bobby looked at each other, and Bobby spoke for both of them. "The man who ran it, he weren't kind. Made us work from dawn to dark, barely fed us, and when we couldn't keep up, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing faded bruises on his thin arm." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. In his younger days, he might have ridden to Cheyenne to have words with such a man. Instead, he focused on ladling beans from the pot, where they had been simmering and plating the crispy bacon. The cornbread was golden brown and steaming when he pulled it from the oven, Martha's recipe, perfectly executed despite his rusty skills. As he set the plates before each child, he watched their faces transform. Little Emma clasped her hands together as if in prayer, while the twins simply stared at the abundance before them. Samuel swallowed hard, and Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Go ahead," Thomas encouraged. "It ain't going to eat itself." What followed was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. The children ate with the desperate efficiency of those who had known true hunger, but they also showed remarkable manners and consideration for each other. Sarah made sure Emma got the choicest pieces of bacon. Samuel shared his cornbread with the twins, and everyone ate slowly enough to savor every bite. As Thomas watched them eat, something shifted inside his chest. For months, he had felt like a man with no purpose, no reason to face each new day. But here were 5 souls who needed exactly what he had: shelter, food, protection, and perhaps most importantly, the wisdom that came from decades of frontier living. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "Sometimes God's plans don't make sense until we're living them." "Where were you planning to go after here?" Thomas asked, once the children had eaten their fill and were sipping milk from Martha's good glasses. Sarah looked uncomfortable. "We weren't really sure, just west maybe. Heard there might be work in the mining towns, even for young uns." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Those mining camps ain't no place for children, especially not a girl. Full of rough men with no manners and plenty of drink." He paused, studying their faces. "Besides, winter's coming fast in this country. You wouldn't last a week once the snows start." The truth of his words settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. These children had been living on hope and determination alone, with no real plan for survival. They were brave, certainly, but bravery wouldn't protect them from Wyoming's brutal winters or the harsh realities of frontier life. "What are you saying, mister?" Emma asked, her small voice barely above a whisper. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he and Martha had worked so hard to build into something meaningful. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that Martha had always loved. In the distance, his cattle were settling in for the night, and smoke rose from the Henderson's chimney across the valley. When he turned back to face the children, his decision was clear in his mind, though he couldn't quite believe he was making it. "I'm saying you can stay," he said simply. "At least through the winter. This house is too big for one old man anyway, and there's plenty of work to be done around a ranch. You'll earn your keep, mind you. I won't have anyone calling you charity cases, but you'll have warm beds, regular meals, and a roof that don't leak." The silence that followed was profound. Then Emma slid down from her chair and walked to Thomas, tugging on his coat until he bent down to her level. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, then kissed his weathered cheek with innocent gratitude. For the first time in 3 months, Thomas McKenna felt something other than despair. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was hope. and for a man who had been planning his own death just hours earlier, hope felt like a miracle. 3 weeks later, Thomas woke to the sound of laughter drifting through his bedroom window, a sound he had thought he would never hear again within these walls. Outside, Billy and Bobby were teaching Samuel how to properly milk Bessie, while Sarah helped little Emma collect eggs from the henhouse. The October morning was crisp, with frost painting the grass silver, but the warmth in Thomas's chest had nothing to do with the weather. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted him. Sarah stood at Martha's stove, her hair now clean and braided, wearing one of Martha's old aprons that had been taken in to fit her smaller frame. She had taken to cooking with the same determination she showed in everything else, and Thomas was amazed at how quickly she had mastered Martha's recipes. "Morning, Mr. McKenna," she said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Breakfast is almost ready. The boys are finishing up with the milking, and Emma's got near a dozen eggs for us." Thomas poured himself coffee from the pot, strong and black, just the way he liked it, and settled at the table. The morning routine had developed naturally over the past weeks, each child finding their place in the rhythm of ranch life. It reminded him of the early days with Martha, when they had worked together to build something meaningful from nothing. "Sarah," he said, watching her flip the bacon with practiced ease, "you don't have to call me Mr. McKenna all the time. Thomas will do just fine." She paused in her work, considering this. "Mama always said to show respect to my elders, especially those who've shown us kindness." "Your mama was right about respect," Thomas agreed. "But there's different kinds of respect, the kind between strangers and the kind between family." The word family hung in the air between them, and Thomas realized he had spoken it without really thinking. But as Sarah's face lit up with joy, he knew it was the right word. These children had become his family in the truest sense, not through blood, but through choice and mutual care. The back door burst open and the other children tumbled in, their cheeks red from the cold morning air. Emma proudly carried a basket of eggs, while the boys hauled in a pail of fresh milk. Samuel, who had been quiet and wary those first days, now chatted excitedly about learning to ride one of the gentler horses. "Thomas," Billy said, having adopted the older man's preference for his first name, "that fence line by the north pasture needs mending before the snow flies. Bobby and me, we could help if you show us how." Thomas nodded approvingly. The twins had thrown themselves into ranch work with enthusiasm, eager to prove their worth. They reminded him of himself at that age, ready to tackle any job, no matter how difficult, as long as someone was willing to teach them. "After breakfast," Thomas promised, "Samuel, you can come too if you want to learn. Mending fence is one of those skills every ranch hand needs to master." As they gathered around the table for their morning meal, Thomas looked at each face and marveled at the transformation. These weren't the same hollow-eyed, desperate children who had stumbled into his barn 3 weeks ago. They were thriving, not just surviving, but truly living again. Their laughter filled Martha's kitchen, and their energy had brought life back to every corner of the house. Emma, who had barely spoken that first day, now chatted constantly about the animals, the changing leaves, and the stories Thomas told them in the evenings by the fireplace. She had claimed Martha's rocking chair as her own, and Thomas found he loved seeing the little girl curled up there with her mended doll, Annie, listening to tales of the old days. After breakfast, as promised, Thomas led the boys to the damaged fence line. The work was hard but satisfying, and he found himself enjoying the role of teacher. He showed them how to properly set posts, how to stretch wire tight without breaking it, and how to make repairs that would last through Wyoming's harsh winters. "Why did you help Mama all those years ago?" Sarah asked during their lunch break, sitting on a fallen log while the boys practiced their knot-tying skills nearby. Thomas considered the question while he whittled a new fence post to the right size. "Your Mama and Grandpa were in need, and we had the means to help. Simple as that. But lots of folks were in need back then. Why them specifically?" Thomas smiled, remembering Martha's reaction when she first saw the Brennan family at the church social. "My Martha, she had an eye for people who were trying to help themselves, but just needed a chance. Your grandpa wasn't looking for charity, he was looking for work, even with his leg busted up. That made all the difference." "And now we're the ones needing help," Samuel observed, joining their conversation. "True enough," Thomas agreed, "but you're also earning your keep, same as your grandpa did. This ranch runs smoother with 5 extra pairs of hands, even if some of those hands are still learning." That evening, after the chores were done and supper was cleared away, the family gathered in the living room. Thomas had retrieved Martha's old Bible from the shelf, where it had sat dusty and unopened since her death. Reading aloud had been her tradition, something she did every evening to whatever children happened to be visiting, and there had always been children visiting Martha. As Thomas read from the book of Ruth about loyalty and new beginnings, he felt Martha's presence strongly, not the crushing weight of loss that had haunted him for months, but a warm sense of approval. She would have loved these children, would have fussed over them and spoiled them and taught them everything she knew about making a house into a home. "Thomas," Emma said sleepily from her place in the rocking chair, "are we really going to stay here forever?" The question caught him off guard, though he supposed it shouldn't have. Children needed certainty, needed to know they were truly safe. "Well now," he said carefully, "I reckon that depends on what you all want. This ranch needs good hands, and you 5 have proven yourselves to be some of the best workers I've ever had. But come spring, if any of you decide you want to try your hand at something else, I won't stand in your way." Sarah looked around at her makeshift family, the twins who had become the brothers she'd never had, Samuel, who treated her with the respect of an equal, little Emma, who had attached herself to Sarah like a devoted daughter, and Thomas, who had become the grandfather figure none of them had ever known. "I think we'd like to stay," she said quietly, "if you'll have us." Thomas set down the Bible and looked at each child in turn. "I'll have you," he said simply. "For as long as you want to stay, this is your home." Later that night, after the children were tucked into their beds, the boys sharing Martha's old sewing room, Sarah in the guest room, and Emma in the small room that had once been meant for the children he and Martha never had. Thomas sat on his porch and looked out at the star-filled sky. The suicide note still lay in the barn, forgotten beneath the dust and horse-tack. He would burn it tomorrow, he decided. Not because he was ashamed of the despair that had driven him to write it, but because it belonged to a different man, a man who thought his usefulness in this world had ended with Martha's death. He had been wrong. Martha's death hadn't ended his story. It had simply turned the page to a new chapter. These 5 children needed what he had to offer, not just shelter and food, but the wisdom of experience, the steadiness of age, and the security of unconditional acceptance. In return, they had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to face each new day with purpose and hope. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of Martha's favorite cottonwood tree, and for just a moment, Thomas could swear he heard her laughter carried on the breeze. Not the sound of haunting memory, but the joyful approval of a woman who had always believed that love multiplied when it was shared, and that the greatest gifts often came disguised as the heaviest burdens. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Winter was coming fast, and there would be hard work ahead preparing for the long, cold months. But tonight, Thomas McKenna sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of a house full of life, and for the first time since Martha's death, he was grateful to be alive. The lonely rancher's farewell letter would never be finished, because the man who had started writing it no longer existed. In his place sat a father, a teacher, a protector, a man who had discovered that sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of another, better one.